of all the stories I've been trying to track in the news, perhaps none lately has become more convoluted or Byzantine than the involvement of various United States actors in the attempts to overthrow the government of Venezuela. So here to talk about that, and particularly, I think one bizarre kind of sideline in the whole Venezuela story, or perhaps it's more than a sideline, is Anya Parampil. Anya is with the Gray Zone, and she's been covering the story of a corporation called, or a company called Silvercorp, and what they have had to do with this situation in Venezuela. So rather than try to set it up myself, I'm just going to welcome Anya to the program. So Anya, welcome to the Zero Hour.
Thanks for inviting me, RJ. Good to be with you.
Well, it's good to have you. And I've got to tell you, as my introduction probably gave away, I'm still trying to wrap my head around this Silvercorp story. So it has something to do with a botched invasion and something out of, I don't know, a bad Amazon Prime Video spy series or something. So if you don't mind,
wrong.
Yeah. So why don't you maybe, if you don't mind, just take it from the top for us in terms of what happened and where Silvercorp fits in.
It's never a dull moment covering Venezuela, I'll tell you that much, because we thought it couldn't get any more absurd after the United States appointed this unknown opposition figure, Juan Guaido, to be president, as far as the U.S. and its allies were concerned last year. But here we are, almost a year and a half into the recognition of Juan Guaido, and the story just gets more and more bizarre. Where do we begin? I would start with May 1st, which is when the Associated Press published an article. And this is when we first heard about Jordan Goudreau. This report claimed that Goudreau, the CEO of a company, a private security firm called Silvercorp USA, had been hired, was contracted by Juan Guaido, the opposition figure the U.S. recognizes as president of Venezuela, to carry out an invasion of Venezuela and actually kidnap the country's elected president, the president who actually controls the border and the military and all of the government ministries, Nicolas Maduro. The AP report was based on interviews with 30 individuals it claims had knowledge of the operation. And Goudreau himself at that time, on May 1st, when the article was published, refused to comment on the existence of the contract discussed in the article. And yet, within 2 days, all of it had been turned on its head. Goudreau had publicly come forward in an interview with Venezuelan opposition media based in Miami, purporting to have signed this contract with Juan Guaido and actually produced the contract, released sections of it through Factores de Poder, this Venezuelan opposition outlet, as well as video, which was claiming to show, which he claimed to show, documented the moment he and Guaido signed this contract. There was no actual visual component that was compelling in the video. It was of the ceiling while they were apparently having this conversation. And you can hear Goudreau talking with an individual he says was Juan Guaido as they signed this contract. The contract was a $212 million agreement during which instructed Goudreau to carry out this capture or kill mission, essentially, in Venezuela, targeting the country's president. And the day Goudreau came forward with this contract and decided to come clean about the operation was the same day Venezuela, this is May 3rd, a Sunday, Venezuela announced that it had neutralized a failed maritime invasion of the country, killing 8 individuals, which they characterized as terrorists, coming in with weapons from Colombia And Goudreau came forward that evening and said, "Those were my guys. This operation is underway." He tweeted at President Trump that night saying that strike force incursion was headed into Venezuela and that it included 2 U.S. citizens. And then, sure enough, the next day, those 2 U.S. citizens, Luke Denman and Aaron Berry, 2 ex-Green Berets, as well as dozens of Venezuelan military defectors, soldiers, were captured. Venezuelan authorities arrested them after they were detained by actually a group of armed fishermen who were patrolling the Venezuelan coast and discovered these 2 U.S. soldiers as well as Venezuelan military defectors riding into the country on boats, supposedly carrying out this operation on behalf of Silvercorp. And since then, around 40 individuals have been arrested and charged in Venezuela, but now we're kind of trying to put the pieces together and figure out who knew what about this operation and when.
So, and again, we're talking with Anya Parampil of thegrayzone.com. There are so many mind-twisting aspects of this story, but I'll start with this one, Anya, which is I subscribe to the New York Times and the Washington Post, and I haven't seen this story on the front page of either newspaper, which seems to me, like it's, maybe I missed it, but it seems to me like this is kind of a big deal when you have an American entity of any kind engaged in attempting to overthrow by force the government of another country. I mean, if it were France, for example, or I don't know, just to pick one country at random, it seems to me like this should be a bigger story than it is. And am I wrong in believing that it has been seriously underplayed by the U.S. media?
I am in total agreement, RJ, especially when you think about the fact that 2 U.S. citizens are now in Venezuelan custody after trying to invade the country and kidnap or kill its president. I find it completely absurd that there's hardly been a word uttered in U.S. media about this case. And I think it's because the powerful figures which carry influence over outlets such as the Washington Post and New York Times, meaning the so-called intelligence community in the United States, isn't exactly sure how to spin this story any more than they already have through the AP report in order to obscure any sort of U.S. involvement. I think the more light is cast on this story, the more people are going to start to question how exactly it's possible U.S. citizens were running a military training camp and shipping weapons into Venezuela and Colombia initially without the knowledge of any U.S. officials. How are they able to pull that off in Colombia? How did U.S. embassy staff in Colombia not know that U.S. citizens were traveling in the country, coming into the country, and organizing a force of around 300 soldiers initially, bringing in heavy weapons? How they managed to do that without detection from U.S. authorities really boggles the mind. And as I documented at the Gray Zone, once you really start to look at the details of this story, it's pretty impossible to deny the U.S. had knowledge of the plan, at the very least, if not if they weren't completely assisting it. I was able to actually get in contact with Jordan Goudreau himself. I had a short conversation with him, which didn't yield much because he actually promised to talk to me the following day, which would have been next Tuesday. Since then, he's gone completely dark, has not spoken with any media outlets, has not responded to any of my messages. And that's because the United States has now opened an investigation into Goudreau for arms trafficking and other charges, in a way, I think, to shut him up and prevent him from telling the full story here. But I was also able to make contact and speak with his business partner and very good friend, the COO of Silvercorp, Drew White. I had a longer conversation with him, which we published at the Gray Zone. And he told me that when Jordan Goudreau initially approached him with this plan, this operation, that he claimed to have a State Department contract. And when Drew White, the business partner, took a closer look at the document, he didn't feel comfortable. He didn't feel like it was official enough or legitimate in order for him to feel comfortable participating in the operation. He lives in Colorado Springs, far away from where Jordan and Silvercorp operate in Florida. And at that point, I believe Jordan Goudreau was mostly working in Central and South America. So Drew White kind of took a step back and told me he'd hoped that his friend would not follow through with this operation. And unfortunately, he did. And now two of their friends and men that they served with overseas are in Venezuelan custody. But I would like to know why Jordan Goudreau was ever under the impression to begin with that he had a State Department contract, because I don't think he would have been telling his business partner and best friend about it unless for some reason someone had given him confidence or was coaxing him behind the scenes and guaranteeing some sort of more official U.S. support. I believe also that if the State Department were involved, it wouldn't put its fingerprint on the operation in such a naked way where it would produce an official contract, but that the testimony of Drew White raises serious questions. And there are more elements in the story if you want to discuss where I can start to build a case that the U.S. government definitely knew this was happening, at least.
Well, of course, Anya Parampil, there's always the concept of plausible deniability, right? Where you can be involved as a government and yet obscure your tracks enough that if anybody ever asks, or if a congressional investigation, House committee or something wants to investigate, you could say, I didn't know. So there's that concept of plausible deniability. But let's talk for a second about Silvercorp USA. Is there anything in its record? I mean, I thought I saw somewhere that they maybe provided security for a Trump rally at some point, or what do we know about their potential relationship with either the Trump administration or the U.S. government in general? Is there any record there?
On Silvercorp's Instagram, there are posts which appear to prove that Silvercorp did provide security for at least one Trump rally in, I believe it was North Carolina. And more significantly, in my view, is the fact that Silvercorp was contracted to provide security for the sort of Venezuela Live Aid concert, which Richard Branson, the billionaire Virgin CEO, threw on the Colombian-Venezuelan border in February of last year, on the date the United States attempted to invade Venezuela under the guise of a humanitarian aid delivery. Jordan Goudreau actually was the individual. Silvercorp was the company providing security for that event. And based on what I can gather, based on what his friend and COO told me, that's kind of the moment that Jordan Goudreau met figures in the Venezuelan opposition and became involved in this plot. It's been reported by the Associated Press that the high-level Venezuelan military defector he was working with to carry out this plot, a man named Cliver Alcala, who actually defected from the Venezuelan government in 2015, was already organizing Venezuelan military defectors in Colombia to carry out an event such as this. But that when he was hooked up with Jordan Goudreau, that's when they decided to join forces and carry out this operation under the guise of Silvercorp. I find it hard to believe that Cliver Alcala was not coordinating with U.S. government officials even before he met Jordan Goudreau, because he was one of the most significant and authoritative Venezuelan military defectors that the United States had to work with in Colombia. I should also note that Cliver Alcala actually released a video on his Twitter account on March 26th, during which he claimed to be involved in a plot to kidnap or kill the president of Venezuela, and that he'd been contracted by Juan Guaido to carry out this operation. He didn't offer any more specific details at the time, but it's very clear now the operation he was referencing in that video was this report, was the one we learned about in this AP report, and we've since come to know as the silvercorp Jordan Goudreau affair. Now, Cliver Alcala, when he released that video, he actually, that same day, turned himself into U.S. authorities in Colombia because he was charged in that indictment some of your viewers may have heard about, which the United States rolled out in March, which charged Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, along with several of his allies, with narco trafficking. And the State Department in March actually released a bounty, a $15 million bounty, which it said it would give to anyone who provided information leading to the capture of Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. That announcement, that bounty was released on March 26th, the same day Cliver Alcala released this video. It just so happened he was named in that indictment and turned himself into U.S. authorities, but his arrest was so friendly that he wasn't even handcuffed, and that Colombian authorities, the Colombian Attorney General, actually released a communique complaining that proper procedure had not been followed by the United States when it detained Cliver Alcala. So what that actually looked like to me was the United States providing a safe exit from Colombia to this Venezuelan general, which was one of the highest-ranking military collaborators the U.S. was working with in order to destabilize Venezuela. And the reason that I'm extra suspicious is that after Alcala turned himself in and was actually in New York in U.S. custody, he ended up being the primary named source in the AP article. So how is it possible that Cliver Alcala spoke with the Associated Press about an operation to capture or kill the president of Venezuela while in U.S. custody without the knowledge or encouragement of the U.S. government? How did they have this individual in custody who was speaking openly to the media about this operation if they themselves were not aware that it was taking place?
Well, and I also was going to ask you about that bounty, Anya Parampil, because the timing seems extraordinary in that you have U.S. government offering this bounty for the capture or, I guess, assassination of Nicolas Maduro. And then immediately thereafter, or shortly thereafter, you have this operation mounted to do precisely that. So the timing seems fortuitous if you're looking at it from the point of view of Silvercorp USA. But I wanted to switch also for a second, if we might, from the U.S. government to Juan Guaido, who presents himself as an idealistic reformer, a democratic reformer in an unjust system, et cetera, et cetera. Where does he get $212 million? First of all, $212 million, I've got to say, seems like a pretty bargain basement price for overthrowing the government of the magnitude of Venezuela. It's such a deal, as they would say. But it also strikes me, if he's a democratic reformer, strictly a man of the people, where does he get $212 million? Has anyone, where does that fit into all of this?
There are so many layers to this case. And since Jordan Goudreau came forward and decided to throw Guaido and the Venezuelan opposition under the bus, it's become clear that there's now an operation being carried out by Guaido's allies to provide cover for the fact they promised him this money and for the fact that Guaido ever signed this contract. So Guaido claims that he did not ever meet Jordan Goudreau, that his signature was essentially forged. And if you take his argument to the logical extreme, you would have to believe that Jordan Goudreau is an agent of Venezuelan intelligence, that he was part of conducting a false flag operation on the Venezuelan government. That's really what you would have to believe if you were to take Guaido at his word, because of the claims that he's made, which is that this was all just a plan by the Venezuelan government to distract from whatever crisis he sees as the true story in Venezuela. But that's just completely absurd. So Jordan Goudreau comes out on Sunday, May 3rd, and says the reason he's decided to step forward and reveal all the information in this contract is because his partners in the deal did not hold up their end of the bargain, meaning Juan Guaido and the Venezuelan opposition. They didn't pay him. They didn't pay him the $212 million. And he said that he felt so backstabbed and betrayed that he'd never seen levels of incompetence that he saw with the Venezuelan opposition, and that they'd demonstrated a complete disregard for his men, which in his mind he'd organized in order to help liberate their country. And so Goudreau starts talking then. He gives this interview to Miami media. He gives an interview to Bloomberg the following day, and that's also the same day he spoke with me and said that he was ready to speak more about the ways in which he felt betrayed by the Venezuelan opposition. And then he goes dark. I believe part of the reason he was silenced is because he said too much when he was speaking with media. He told Bloomberg, in fact, that the Venezuelan opposition had access to the Citgo accounts. Many of your viewers and yourself probably know of Citgo as a gas station that we see all around the country. Well, it's actually a distribution center and production line of it's an extension, a subsidiary of Venezuela's national oil company. So the gas that we get from Citgo over the years was actually supplied by the Venezuelan government, and the money in those accounts belonged to the Venezuelan government until last year, when the United States froze all of Venezuela's international accounts. And people such as myself, for the entirety of the coup, have asserted that they transferred some of that money, at least some of it, into the hands of the Venezuelan opposition figures that represent Guaido in the United States. They've denied continuously that they have access to these accounts. They claim that they don't have any ability to tap the funds in the Citgo accounts. But somebody obviously told Jordan Goudreau a different story. And so when he made that comment saying they have this Citgo money, they're given all this money, he was contradicting claims by the Venezuelan opposition and revealing a piece of the story that I don't think U.S. officials really wanted him to reveal either. The fact that the Venezuelan oppositionists who represent Guaido are essentially running rampant with the money, the stolen wealth, which belongs to the Venezuelan government and has been handed over to them. In fact, just a few weeks before this story was reported in the AP, an individual in Venezuela's opposition, a man by the name of Francisco Rodriguez, he's a Venezuelan lawyer or financial analyst, he suggested to Guaido's administration that they use some of the money in these accounts to give some sort of assistance and help to Venezuelan migrants and refugees. And what Guaido's office said at the time is, oh, we don't have any access to that money. Well, then another AP report reveals just a few weeks later that the National Assembly, led by Guaido in Venezuela, have passed a budget paying themselves $2,000 a month. And it said this in the AP report, from a fund created by the U.S. government with assets belonging to the Venezuelan government, which they've transferred to what they see as the Venezuelan government being led by Juan Guaido. So they were lying. They were lying that they didn't have any access to this money. And that has slowly come out as a result of this Goudreau scandal, which is why, since Goudreau has been muzzled, however they managed to pull that off, Guaido allies have been running to the Washington Post and claiming, oh, Guaido had no knowledge of this. It was just us, his lawyers and his political consultants in the United States, who signed this agreement. Guaido never signed it. We gave Jordan Goudreau $50,000 out of our own pocket to try and make him confident that we were going to back him in this operation. But then we pulled out, and he just went along with it for no reason that we're aware of, and with no support from Juan Guaido. Those two individuals, JJ Rendon and Sergio Vergara, resigned in order to make it look as though Guaido was responding to this crisis and cleaning house responsibly after he was exposed for having signed this contract. And really, at this point, I think even figures in the Venezuelan opposition and some of his allies must be a little bit fed up, because he's now implicated in a direct attempted invasion of the country. And that's just hard to respect if you're a Venezuelan, even if you're among the opposition. Who would do that? I mean, can you imagine hearing about someone in the United States? It would be like if Hillary Clinton contracted a bunch of Venezuelan soldiers to try and invade the United States and overthrow Donald Trump. I think even
which, by the way, Anya Parampil, I have to interrupt you to say, which, by the way, would be extraordinarily illegal, but would increase my respect for Hillary Clinton. But that's the multiple questions already keep popping up in my head. One of them is, first of all, if AP wrote a story about the members of the assembly, alternate assembly, paying themselves, and just mentioned in passing that it was out of these funds, I would say they buried the lead, which is that, in fact, these funds exist are being accessed by the opposition. I mean, if I were the journalist writing that story, I'd say that's a story I want to know more about, number one. Number two, I guess you could argue that this is a disinformation attempt on behalf of the Venezuelan intelligence services to discredit Guaido, but it's an awfully roundabout way of doing it. I mean, if I were the Venezuelan intelligence services, I would think most people would do it the old-fashioned way and implicate him in, drugs or prostitution or something. Seemed like an obscure way of going about it. And thirdly, I guess I would say if JJ Rendon or anyone else says, well, they gave Silvercorp 50 grand. Well, it sounds like they spent a lot more than $50,000 putting this operation together. So where did the money come from?
That I agree with all those questions. I find it really hard to believe that Venezuelan intelligence has infiltrated all the way up to Cocoa Beach, Florida, which is where Jordan Goudreau works. I just don't believe that they would have an agent in the United States working on their behalf in that way. It's completely absurd. And then completely agree as well with your questions regarding the funding. It should be the number one question. The United States, actually, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo gave a very careful answer. He said that the United States is not ready to talk about where the funding came from. So that means they know where it came from. And I'm with you. I don't believe that this operation only cost 50 grand. I also don't believe that Jordan Goudreau would go forward with the operation and send his friends into Venezuela having only received 50 grand. And just one other point that I'll make on the question of Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's knowledge. Days before this operation was scheduled to be carried out, Pompeo actually told reporters in Washington that he was instructing his staff to revisit and update plans to reopen Venezuela, the U.S. Embassy in Venezuela, in Caracas, which has been shut down since last year when the United States instigated this coup against the country. Venezuela dismissed the U.S. charge d'affaires and the embassy staff after it was clear the United States was openly trying to overthrow the government. And since then, those individuals have been working out of what the U.S. says is a virtual embassy in the Colombian capital, Bogota. So again, if we're talking about how is it possible these U.S. citizens are working in Colombia without knowledge of U.S. officials, we should start asking if any of the individuals working for the U.S. virtual embassy to Venezuela in Colombia were aware of this, and why Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was so confident that his staff would be able to return to Venezuela. What were his underlings in the State Department telling him? What did they know about the possibility that this operation was going to be carried out, and Maduro was somehow going to be on a plane to the United States to face charges? It just doesn't it seems like more of a coincidence, more than a coincidence, I should say, that Pompeo would make comments like this just days before a bunch of U.S. Green Berets and military defectors from Venezuela were going to go and try and capture or kill the president.
And a couple last thoughts, Anya. One is, if it turns out that in fact Guaido did make this deal, it's kind of makes it look a little sad. I mean, if you've got to pay people to try to carry out your revolution, it kind of says that you don't have a lot of
pay
support.
Foreigners.
Yeah, yeah, and I guess my final question to you is: given that our major media outlets are not aggressively pursuing this story, shall we say, where do you see it going? I assume you're planning to pursue it further, and what questions are you going to be asking, and where will you be looking?
I'm going to start with the families of the U.S. citizens who are now detained in Venezuela. I personally believe that this whole experience has only demonstrated why the only logical path forward for the United States is direct engagement with Venezuela's actual government. I believe the Venezuelan government would love to return Aaron Berry and Luke Denman to the United States, but that they would like a few things in return, perhaps sanctions relief, perhaps they could have the billions of dollars stored in U.S. accounts and European accounts returned to the Venezuelan people, returned to their elected government. But from what I know so far, and from what I've last heard based on my conversations with people who have knowledge of the family situation, is that the U.S. government hasn't contacted the families of the U.S. Green Berets involved, and that it's actually quite common in cases of U.S. citizens being detained abroad that the U.S. government essentially leaves them to fend for themselves. Unless they're journalists or people of high caliber. I know people probably remember the case of Lisa Ling, the reporter who was detained in North Korea, and through, I believe, Bill Richardson and Dennis Rodman negotiations with those right. U.S. figures, eventually was returned to the United States. But it presents an opportunity for the U.S. government to engage with Venezuela and get these U.S. citizens returned if they would like to. So that's definitely something that I think should be pressed. The Trump administration should be pressed here. They should be revealed as responsible for getting these U.S. citizens detained based on the information we have. They should take responsibility for that, and they should do everything they can to bring them home. And if this was a test, if this was supposed to be a test balloon to see how Venezuela's military would unite in the event of an outside attack, it seems as though the United States lost this round, and they should just start taking the situation more seriously, start moving on from their pipe dream of Juan Guaido and accept reality here, because it did get a lot more serious with the capture of these two U.S. citizens. With somebody like Elliot Abrams directing State Department policy on Venezuela, you start to fear that this could be part of something bigger, that they want to spark an invasion to save these two Americans, or model something off the Panama invasion of '89, when under the guise of fighting drug trafficking, the United States invaded Panama and captured its president, Manuel Noriega. The U.S. could try to do the same thing in Venezuela. In fact, William Barr, the current Attorney General, wrote the legal justification for Panama. And someone like Elliot Abrams is serving in the Trump administration. This operation just has his smell all over it. It's exactly the kind of thing Elliot Abrams would orchestrate in order to make his objective in Venezuela possible. So I think we have to blow the lid off of the participation and the knowledge of U.S. officials and start to have a serious conversation about how to bring these two U.S. citizens home and engage in real diplomacy and peace with Venezuela.
Well, if I were a family member, I would certainly want to make a public case for bringing them home. And if I were in the United States government, I guess I would caution that Venezuela is considerably larger than Panama. So,
Yeah.
but
Yes.
unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Anya Parampil, fascinating and complex story. I'm glad you're on it. Appreciate that. And thank you for coming on the program.
I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to speak about it, RJ. Thank you.